Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight's story is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Episode 2, The Harvest Gathering. Before we begin, if these stories bring you comfort, I'd love for you to subscribe so you can always find your way back whenever you need a quiet place to rest. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let's return to the quiet valley of Sleepy Hollow. The visitor who arrived at the schoolhouse that afternoon was one of Baltus Van Tassel's younger servants, mounted upon a shaggy little horse and carrying news important enough to interrupt the day's lessons. There was to be a gathering at the Van Tassel farm that very evening. Ichabod received the invitation with the composure expected of a schoolmaster. At least, he attempted to. He read the message once, then again. The children watched as his expression brightened and his unusual seriousness gave way to something dangerously close to delight. For several moments, he seemed to forget that a lesson was in progress. Then, recovering himself, he announced that the pupils had worked unusually well and might be dismissed a little early. This judgment was greeted with enthusiasm. Books closed, benches scraped. Children rushed toward the door before Ichabod could reconsider. Within moments, the schoolhouse was empty. Ichabod stood alone in the sudden quiet, still holding the invitation. A gathering at the Van Tassel farm offered several pleasures at once. There would be music, and there would be dancing, and there would almost certainly be a table of remarkable abundance. And Katrina would be there. That final thought sent him at once toward the small piece of looking glass that hung near the schoolhouse wall. The reflection it offered was neither large nor especially flattering, but Ichabod leaned toward it with careful attention. He smoothed his hair. He adjusted his collar. He turned his head slightly, considering which angle best suited his long features. None proved entirely satisfactory. Still, he wasn't discouraged. A man of learning, he believed, should not be judged by ordinary standards of beauty. What he lacked in breadth, he possessed in refinement. What he lacked in fashionable clothing, he might make up for in conversation. And if conversation failed, there was always singing. Ichabod hurried to the farmhouse where he was lodging that week and began the serious business of preparing himself. His best suit wasn't new. Indeed, it may never have been especially fine, but it was brushed carefully, shaken free of dust, and examined for any defect likely to become noticeable in candlelight. He polished his shoes. He arranged his hair once more. He even practiced a bow in the dim reflection of a window, though the movement required so much folding of his long body that he nearly upset a chair. The farmer's wife watched these preparations with growing amusement. She offered to straighten his collar. One of the children brought him a comb. Another asked whether he meant to marry Katrina that very evening. Ichabod replied that such matters were not decided in haste. He said this with the dignity of a man who had already imagined the wedding, the inheritance, and the eventual sale of the farm. There remained one practical difficulty. Ichabod owned no horse. Walking to the gathering was possible, but arriving on foot lacked the effect he desired. A gentleman calling upon a young woman should appear with some degree of consequence, particularly when his chief rival was likely to arrive upon the finest horse in the hollow. So Ichabod approached the old farmer beneath whose roof he was staying and requested the loan of a mount. The farmer agreed readily enough. In his younger years, the old man had apparently been something of a spirited rider himself. Age had quieted him considerably, though the occasional brightness in his eye suggested that he had not entirely forgotten the pleasure of a fast horse beneath him. The animal he offered, Ichabod, had once belonged to his livelier days. His name was Gunpowder. There had been a time when the name was said to suit him perfectly. Gunpowder had once been strong, fiery, and difficult to restrain. He had carried his master over rough roads and open fields with enthusiasm rather than caution, and there were still people in the hollow who remembered when the horse and the rider had been among the boldest pair in the countryside. Time, however, had softened them both. The farmer had exchanged hard riding for quieter evenings beside the fire, and Gunpowder had exchanged speed for patience. He was old now. He was thin, and one eye had lost much of its brightness, and his mane had become tangled with burrs. His neck carried the weary droop of a creature who had seen enough of the world to expect very little from it. Yet he had not become an entirely ordinary horse. Beneath the worn saddle and the stiffness of age, some trace of his former spirit remained. From time to time, his ears would lift sharply, his head would rise, and for a brief moment, there was something in his bearing that suggested the bold creature he had once been. The old farmer appeared to notice it too. He gave Gunpowder's neck an affectionate pat before handing Ichabod the reins. "He still remembers himself now and then," he remarked. Ichabod looked over the horse with cautious approval. Gunpowder stood high enough. His legs, though stiff, were long, and he possessed just enough faded dignity to persuade Ichabod that the arrangement might succeed. Horse and rider made an unusual pair. Ichabod's stirrups were far too short, forcing his knees upward. His elbows stood out sharply from his sides. As Gunpowder began to move, Ichabod's narrow frame rose and fell with every step, while his coat-tails fluttered behind him. From a distance, they might have appeared less like a gentleman riding to an autumn celebration, and more like some enormous grasshopper carried unwillingly upon an aging fence rail. Ichabod, fortunately, couldn't see himself. He sat as proudly as circumstance allowed. The old farmer watched them depart from the yard. Perhaps the sight reminded him of his earlier years. Perhaps it merely amused him. Whatever his thoughts, he stood at the gate for some time after Ichabod and Gunpowder had turned onto the road. The afternoon had begun to soften. A warm autumn light rested over the hollow. The fields were rich with the fading gold of the season, and the woods along the road had begun to deepen into shades of amber and brown. Here and there, leaves loosened from the branches and drifted slowly across Ichabod's path. Farmers were finishing their day's work. Smoke rose from distant chimneys, and somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barked and was answered by another far away. The road to the Van Tassel farm wound through familiar country, yet everything seemed more beautiful to Ichabod that afternoon. Expectation has a way of improving the landscape. Each turn brought him closer to Katrina. Each field reminded him of prosperity, and each orchard seemed to suggest pies. Even Gunpowder appeared to feel the importance of the occasion. For much of the journey, he maintained the patient pace of an animal who had long ago stopped hurrying for anyone. But now and then, something awakened in him. A bird rose suddenly from the roadside, a branch snapped in the woods, a distant horse called from beyond a fence. At each sound, Gunpowder lifted his head and lengthened his stride for several steps before remembering his age and returning to his former pace. Ichabod found these brief displays encouraging. He began to believe the old horse might still possess considerable spirit when properly guided. Gunpowder, for his part, offered no opinion. Ichabod allowed his thoughts to travel ahead. He pictured Katrina welcoming him at the door. He imagined her noticing the care he had taken with his appearance. Perhaps she would ask him to sing. Perhaps they would dance. Perhaps, before the evening ended, she would offer some sign that her affection rested not with bronze bones, but with a man of education and finer sensibilities. This pleasant vision lasted until the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached him from behind. They came quickly, confidently. Gunpowder's ears lifted at once. His head rose higher than Ichabod had seen it yet, and for the briefest moment, the years seemed to fall away from him. Ichabod turned the saddle just as a powerful horse swept into view along the road. Upon its back sat Brom Bones. He rode daredevil with effortless ease, one hand resting lightly upon the reins. His clothes suited him perfectly. His posture was careless, and the smile he gave Ichabod suggested that he found the entire scene before him deeply entertaining. Brom slowed just enough to ride beside the schoolmaster. He glanced at Gunpowder, then at Ichabod's raised knees, then back at Gunpowder. "Fine evening for a ride," he observed. Ichabod agreed that it was. For a moment, the two men continued side by side. Daredevil moved with restless strength, tossing his head and pulling lightly against the reins. Gunpowder watched him closely. Some old memory appeared to stir. His neck straightened, his stride quickened, and Ichabod felt the change beneath him and sat a little taller. Perhaps, he thought, Gunpowder had been underestimated. Then Brom touched his heels to Daredevil's flanks. The horse sprang forward. Gunpowder made one sudden effort to follow. It was not a graceful effort. His legs gathered beneath him, his head lifted, and for several determined strides he lunged after the younger horse with a burst of enthusiasm that nearly unseated his rider. Ichabod clutched the reins. His elbows flew outward. His hat tipped dangerously to one side. But the moment passed almost as quickly as it had come, and Daredevil was already racing down the road, carrying Brom toward the Van Tassel farm in a cloud of dust and fallen leaves. Gunpowder slowed, then slowed again, and within moments he had returned to his patient, familiar pace. Still, Ichabod regarded him with a new respect. The old horse had spirit after all. It was simply buried beneath many years and required the proper insult to awaken it. Ichabod straightened his hat. He adjusted his collar. He gathered the reins, and with all the dignity he could recover, continued toward the gathering. Ahead, beyond the darkening trees, the first lights of the Van Tassel farmhouse had begun to glow. The Van Tassel farmhouse stood bright against the deepening evening. Warm light glowed from every window, spilling across the porch and resting in golden patches upon the yard. Beyond it, the fields had already begun to fade into shadow, and the trees surrounding the farm rose dark and still against the last pale color of the sky. From somewhere inside came the lively sound of a fiddle. Voices followed, and laughter, the scrape of chairs across wooden floors. Now and then, the front door opened, releasing another burst of music into the quiet autumn air, before closing once more. Ichabod felt his spirits rise. Gunpowder appeared to notice the activity as well. The old horse lifted his head as they entered the yard, where wagons stood beneath the trees and horses had been tied along the fence. Some stamped impatiently in the cooling air. Others lowered their heads and waited with the calm resignation of animals accustomed to carrying their owners to village gatherings. Lanterns hung from porch and nearby branches, their flames flickering gently in the breeze, throwing restless shadows across the ground. For all the warmth of the farmhouse, the hollow had not entirely released its hold upon the evening. Beyond the circle of the lantern light, the orchard stretched away in rows of darkening trees. Leaves whispered along the lane, and somewhere, near the barn, a loose shutter tapped softly against the wall. Ichabod glanced toward the sound. It was only the wind, almost certainly. Gunpowder gave no sign of concern. He had already discovered a small pile of hay near the fence and seemed prepared to remain there for the rest of the night. Ichabod dismounted carefully. The ride had left his legs somewhat stiff and his appearance somewhat less polished than when he had departed the old farmer's house. His coat had gathered dust. His hair had not survived the journey as well as he had hoped, and one side of his collar had begun to fold inward. He corrected each problem as well as circumstances allowed. He brushed his sleeves, straightened his coat, smoothed his hair with both hands. Then he adjusted his collar and stood back as though judging the work of a skilled tailor. It would have to do. A servant came forward to take Gunpowder's reins. The old horse watched Ichabod leave with one dim, thoughtful eye, then returned his attention to the hay. Several guests were arriving at the same time. Men climbed down from wagons and helped their wives and daughters to the ground. Greetings passed easily among them, for nearly everyone present had known the others for years. The old farmer spoke of the harvest, the roads, and the changing weather. Their wives exchanged family news. Young people gathered near the porch, where the music could be heard most clearly. And Ichabod recognized many familiar faces from the hollow, parents of his pupils, members of his singing school, farmers whose tables he had visited, women who had listened to his stories beside their evening fires. He received several warm greetings as he crossed the yard. "Schoolmaster!" one man called from beside a wagon. Ichabod raised his hand graciously. A woman asked whether he intended to sing before the evening was over. "If the company should request it," he replied most modestly. He had every intention of making himself available. Another guest praised the progress of one of Ichabod's pupils. Ichabod accepted the compliment as though he alone had brought the child from complete ignorance into the light of learning. He was beginning to feel quite at ease. Then he noticed Daredevil. The powerful horse stood tied near the porch, restless even among the noise and the movement of the gathering. His dark coat shone beneath the lantern light, and one front hoof struck the earth with impatient force. Brom Bones had already arrived. Ichabod's confidence dimmed slightly. He looked toward the farmhouse. The front door stood open. Music flowed through it, along with the glow of candles and the mingled aromas of supper being prepared somewhere deeper inside. Fresh bread, roasted meat, apples warming with spice, butter, pastry. Ichabod breathed deeply. Whatever difficulty Brom might present, the evening still held many consolations. He climbed the porch steps. Near the doorway, a group of older men had gathered beneath the lanterns. Their faces were weathered by years spent outdoors, and their coats had been carefully brushed for the occasion. One of them was recalling a storm from some autumns long ago. Another interrupted to insist that the storm had occurred in spring. The disagreement showed every sign of lasting well into supper. Inside, the gathering had filled nearly every part of the lower floor. Candles burned along the walls and upon the tables, their light warming the polished wood and shining softly against the brass, glass, and carefully arranged dishes. The older women sat together where they could observe the room. They spoke quietly among themselves while missing very little of what passed before them. Young men stood in small groups, laughing more loudly than the conversation required, and young women moved between them in bright ribbons and their best dresses, each pretending not to notice who was watching. The fiddler sat near the far wall, drawing a lively tune from his instrument while several guests cleared space for dancing. Ichabod paused just inside the doorway. For a moment, the familiar farmhouse seemed changed. It was the same home he had visited before, the same broad rooms, the same welcoming hearth. Yet, candlelight, music, and expectation had given it the quality of some enchanted place. Outside, the dark fields and the old roads of Sleepy Hollow waited beneath the autumn night. Inside, everything was warmth. Everything was promise. And somewhere, among the bright dresses, moving candles, and gathering dancers, was Katrina Van Tassel. Ichabod searched the room. He saw several of his singing pupils. Baltus Van Tassel stood near the hearth, welcoming guests with his unusual good humor. Brum Bones had placed himself among a group of young men. Laughing at something one of them had said, he appeared entirely at home, as though the gathering had been arranged largely for his benefit. Still, Ichabod did not see Katrina. He stepped farther inside. A passing guest greeted him. Another moved aside. Then the crowd shifted near the center of the room. A ribbon caught the candlelight, and Katrina stood beyond the dancers, speaking with one of the newly arrived families. Her dress was simple enough to seem effortless, and carefully chosen enough to make that simplicity impossible to believe. Her face was bright with the pleasure of the evening. She laughed at something her companion had said. Ichabod forgot Brom. He forgot Gunpowder. He nearly forgot the supper. Then Katrina looked across the room. Her eyes found him. Then she smiled. Katrina's smile was enough to carry Ichabod across the room. He moved toward her with what he hoped was calm assurance, though the crowded floor required him to bend, to turn, and carefully gather his long limbs around chairs, guests, and passing skirts. By the time he reached her, he had nearly collided with one young man, stepped backward into another, and narrowly avoided upsetting a tray. None of this appeared to trouble him. Katrina welcomed him warmly. "I'm glad you came, Mr. Crane." Ichabod bowed. The movement was more successful than when he had practiced earlier, though it still required a remarkable amount of folding. "I could hardly refuse so gracious an invitation." Katrina's eyes brightened. "Then we shall expect you to dance." Ichabod assured her that nothing would give him greater pleasure. That was not entirely true. Supper might have given him greater pleasure, but dancing came very close. Before he could say more, another guest claimed Katrina's attention, and Ichabod found himself drawn into the cheerful movement of the room. The Van Tassel gathering had brought together nearly every sort of person found in the hollow. There were old farmers whose faces had been browned by long years beneath the sun. Their wives sat nearby in careful chosen gowns, exchanging quiet observations about the younger guest. There were daughters in bright ribbons and young men who had polished their boots with such care that they seemed reluctant to step too heavily upon the floor. Even the children had been allowed to remain awake beyond their usual hour, though several were already beginning to droop against chairs or lean sleepily against their mothers. Near the hearth stood Baltus Van Tassel. He welcomed each new arrival with the easy kindness of a man who took genuine pleasure in seeing his home filled with friends. Baltus was not a man given to ceremony. He did not measure hospitality in elegant words or fine manners. He measured it in the number of chairs drawn near a fire, the fullness of the table, and whether every guest had been persuaded to stay longer than intended. That evening, by all appearances, he meant to succeed in each. The fiddle quickened. The second musician joined with a smaller instrument, and several young people moved into the open space at the center of the room. Ichabod watched with growing eagerness. He considered dancing one of his finer accomplishments. His opinion was not universally shared. When the next set began, Katrina stepped forward. Ichabod offered his hand. Across the room, Brum Bones noticed. Brom had been leaning against the wall with several companions, apparently unconcerned by anything around him. Yet, the moment Katrina took Ichabod's hand, his laughter faded. Only briefly. Then he smiled again. It wasn't an angry smile. It was the expression of a man who had just discovered that the evening might provide better entertainment than he had expected. Ichabod led Katrina onto the floor. The musicians began, and the schoolmaster came alive. There was no hesitation in him now, no nervous adjustment of his collar or coat, no cautious concern for how he appeared. Ichabod surrendered himself entirely to the dance. His long arms moved, his knees rose, his feet struck the floor with surprising energy. At moments, he seemed less to dance upon the boards than just to hover just above them, his narrow body leaping and turning with a freedom no one would have predicted from his unusual careful manner. His elbows flew outward, his coattails swept behind him. His entire frame appeared to come apart and reassemble itself with every turn. The effect was extraordinary. A few of the older women lowered their eyes to hide their amusement. Several children stared openly. One little boy attempted to imitate Ichabod from beside the wall and nearly fell over a stool. Ichabod noticed none of it. He believed himself graceful. More importantly, Katrina was smiling. This encouraged him beyond measure. He stepped higher, turned faster, and on one particularly enthusiastic movement, came so close to the fiddler that the man leaned backward without missing a note. The company laughed. Ichabod took the sound for admiration. Katrina did not correct him. She moved easily through the dance, bright and composed, offering Ichabod just enough attention to keep him hopeful. At times she smiled directly at him. At others, her gaze traveled past his shoulder toward the guests gathered near the wall. Whether she looked for Brom, Ichabod could not tell. He preferred not to wonder. For the moment, Katrina's hand rested in his. The musicians played, the candles shone, and every turn of the dance seemed to carry him closer to the future he had already imagined. He pictured himself dancing with her at their wedding. He pictured the room filled again with neighbors and music. He pictured Baltus looking on with satisfaction. The vision expanded so quickly that Ichabod nearly missed the next step. Katrina guided him back into place with a light touch. "Careful, Mr. Crane." Ichabod recovered at once. "I was merely anticipating the movement." Katrina laughed. Across the room, Brom folded his arms. His companions had begun watching Ichabod as closely as everyone else. One of them whispered something. Brom answered without taking his eyes from the dancers. Whatever he said caused the group to laugh. And Ichabod saw this. He lifted his chin. If Brom intended to unsettle him, he would be disappointed. This was a contest in which strength mattered very little. Dancing required rhythm, refinement, sensitivity, all qualities Ichabod believed himself to possess in abundance. The first dance ended. Before Ichabod could offer Katrina his arm again, another young man stepped forward. Katrina accepted him pleasantly. Ichabod moved aside with all the grace he could manage. He didn't care for the interruption. Still, the new partner was not Brom, which made the disappointment easier to bear. The musicians began another tune. Ichabod stood near the wall, pretending to take a thoughtful interest in the performance while watching Katrina closely. She danced with one guest, then another. Each received a smile. They seemed encouraged by it. Ichabod began to understand why so many young men had found themselves hopeful in her presence. Katrina possessed the uncommon ability to make a person feel especially noticed while offering nearly the same kindness to everyone else. It was a different gift. Brom finally left his place near the wall. He crossed the room without hurry. Guests moved aside for him almost without realizing they had done so. And when he paused, he approached Katrina and offered his hand. There was no elaborate bow, no carefully prepared compliment. Brom merely looked at her with the confidence of a man who expected to be welcomed. Katrina accepted, and Ichabod's expression tightened. The next tune began. Brom danced very differently from the schoolmaster. He didn't leap. He did not scatter his limbs in every direction. He moved with the same easy control he showed upon horseback, strong and certain, never appearing to make an effort. Katrina seemed entirely comfortable beside him. They laughed together. Once Brom leaned closer to say something meant only for her. Katrina looked toward Ichabod. Then she smiled. Ichabod could not decide whether the smile was affectionate, apologetic, or teasing. This uncertainty troubled him more than an unfriendly look would have done. He turned his attention toward the musicians. The fiddler was an elderly man with a red face, a narrow coat, and a deeply serious expression of someone performing work of great importance. Ichabod nodded in time with the tune. Then, unable to remain still, he began marking the rhythm with one foot. A nearby woman asked whether he would sing later. Ichabod replied that he would be pleased to contribute if the evening required it. He spoke loudly enough for several people to hear. Brom heard too. He glanced toward Ichabod. "Perhaps the dog may join us," he remarked. Several of his companions laughed. Ichabod knew precisely which dog Brom meant. He chose not to answer. Katrina, however, gave Brom a light look of warning. Whether she disapproved of the joke or merely wished to preserve peace beneath her father's roof was impossible to say. But Brom fell silent. Ichabod noticed. His spirits rose again, and the evening moved forward in music and conversation. Dance followed dance. The air grew warm from candlelight, the hearth, and the constant movement of the guests. Windows were opened slightly, allowing the cool autumn air to enter, and whenever the curtains stirred, darkness appeared beyond them. The orchard was no longer visible. The yard had vanished. Only the lanterns near the porch remained, floating like small golden lights against the night. Inside, no one seemed concerned. The fiddle continued. Shoes struck the floor. Laughter traveled from room to room. Yet now and then, when the music paused, the old house settled around them. The wind moved through the trees outside. A branch brushed against the roof. The sound was soft enough to be ignored. Almost everyone did. Ichabod heard it. His eyes lifted toward the ceiling. Then the musicians began again, and Katrina returned to his side. "Another dance, Mr. Crane." The darkness beyond the windows disappeared from his thoughts, and Ichabod bowed and offered his hand. "With pleasure." Brom watched as they moved back onto the floor. This time, Ichabod danced with even greater determination. He rose upon his toes, he turned, he stretched. His shadow leaped enormously along the candlelit wall, thin and strange, bending over the seated guests as though some other long-limbed creature had joined the celebration. A child noticed it and pointed. Her mother gently lowered her hand. The musicians played faster. Katrina laughed. And for several bright, breathless minutes, Ichabod Crane believed the evening belonged entirely to him. Then, from somewhere beyond the dancing room, came the first welcome sound of dishes being carried toward the table. Ichabod heard it at once. His head turned. The music continued, but the schoolmaster's attention had already begun to wander toward supper. The announcement spread through the farmhouse with remarkable speed. No sooner had the final dance ended than conversation shifted almost instantly toward the adjoining room. Guests smiled knowingly. Children appeared suddenly alert. Even the musicians lowered their instruments with satisfied expressions. It was time for supper. If there existed any event capable of rivaling the dancing in Ichabod Crane's affections, this was surely it. He followed the gathering with admirable restraint, at least until the doorway came into view. Then his pace increased ever so slightly. The dining room presented a sight capable of warming even the most disciplined heart. The great table stretched nearly the length of the room beneath the glow of candles, every inch displaying the generous abundance for which Van Tassels were known throughout the countryside. There were magnificent roasted fowls, their golden skin glistening in the candlelight. Platters of smoked ham rested beside roasted beef. Fresh loaves of bread still carried the warmth of the oven. Butter, churned only that morning, stood in generous bowls beside soft cheeses and preserves. There were potatoes dressed with cream, sweet corn, turnips, pickled vegetables, stewed apples. Bright jars of jams and jellies caught the candlelight like stained glass. And then there were the desserts. apple pies, pumpkin pies, mince pies, fruit tarts, cakes dusted lightly with sugar, bowls of peaches preserved from the summer's harvest, rich cream waiting patiently beside them. The fragrance alone was enough to make conversation pause. Even those who had admired the table many times before could not help smiling at the familiar display. Baltus Van Tassel looked over the company with quiet satisfaction. Nothing pleased him more than seeing friends gathered beneath his roof, with every expectation of leaving well-fed. He encouraged everyone to serve themselves freely. There was no need for ceremony here. Hospitality in the Van Tassel household was measured in abundance. Ichabod required very little encouragement. He accepted his plate with appropriate gratitude before beginning the serious work before him. He approached the table with the thoughtful concentration of a scholar entering an important examination. Each choice deserved careful consideration. To begin too heavily might leave insufficient room for later discoveries. To begin too cautiously would be equally regrettable. He settled upon a strategy that seemed both practical and ambitious. A slice of ham, a generous helping of roast fowl, fresh bread, potatoes, corn, then another visit might be devoted entirely to pies. The plan appeared sound. Unfortunately, every few steps revealed another dish that seemed equally deserving of attention. His plate grew steadily heavier. By the time he reached his chair, it required both hands. Katrina, seated not far away, noticed his careful balancing act and smiled. "You seem to have chosen a little of everything." Ichabod regarded his plate thoughtfully. "I should dislike showing partiality." Katrina laughed softly. "I fear the table may defeat even your appetite tonight." "I confess," Ichabod replied with quiet dignity, "I consider that unlikely." The meal began. Conversation rose and fell throughout the room in cheerful waves. Old farmers exchanged stories of harvests, both fortunate and disappointing. Their wives discussed gardens, neighbors, and families, and young people laughed together, though many seemed more interested in watching one another than in eating. Baltus moved easily among his guests, urging second helpings upon anyone whose plate appeared less than entirely full. No one escaped his notice, least of all Ichabod. "Mr. Crane," Baltus called with obvious pleasure, "you've scarcely touched the beef." Ichabod looked down. His plate was already remarkably well occupied. Still, there did appear to be room, a small amount. He accepted another serving. It seemed only polite. The conversation drifted from one pleasant subject to another: the coming winter, the quality of this year's apples, whether the river might freeze earlier than usual. Now and then, laughter spread from one end of the table to the other before fading into quieter conversation once more. Ichabod contributed whenever opportunity allowed. He spoke knowledgeably of singing, of education, of the newest books he had yet encountered. He quoted poetry when the moment appeared suitable. Whether every listener followed the quotation mattered rather less than the impressive manner in which it had been delivered. Katrina listened with patient amusement. Now and then she asked a question. Now and then she offered a gentle observation of her own. Ichabod could not help noticing that she seemed perfectly content in his company. Across the table, however, Brom Bones noticed the same thing. Brom had never been a particularly subtle man. His amusement was plainly visible. Whenever Ichabod grew especially animated in conversation, Brom appeared to discover something equally fascinating elsewhere. At one point, he leaned toward a neighboring guest and murmured a remark that caused several young men to chuckle behind their cups. Ichabod pretended not to notice. He devoted himself instead to another helping of potatoes. Food, after all, was seldom insulting. As the meal continued, Ichabod found his imagination wandering once more. It required very little encouragement. He looked around the warm dining room, the polished furniture, the silver, the the china, the generous table, the comforting hearth. Then his thoughts moved naturally beyond them. How pleasant it would be to sit at this table every evening, to welcome neighbors beneath this roof, to walk each morning through orchards that would one day belong to him, to oversee the harvest, to enjoy the quiet prosperity that surrounded the Van Tassel household. His eyes drifted toward Katrina. She was speaking with one of her friends now, smiling at something that had been said. The candlelight rested gently upon her face. Ichabod smiled to himself. The future seemed surprisingly near. Outside, the autumn wind moved softly through the orchard. Its voice reached the room only faintly through the windows. Within the farmhouse, the candles burned steadily. The fire glowed. The plates emptied, then filled again. The evening seemed wrapped in such warmth and contentment that it was difficult to imagine anything unpleasant existing beyond the circle of light. Yet, Sleepy Hollow had always possessed a curious habit. Even on its happiest evenings, the shadows waited patiently beyond the windows, and before the night was over, those shadows would have their turn. As the last of the supper dishes disappeared from the table, the company settled once more into the comfortable rooms of the Van Tassel farm. The younger guests gradually returned to lighter conversation. Some resumed dancing. Others wandered onto the porch to enjoy the cool autumn air before returning to the warmth inside. The older members of the gathering, however, found themselves drawn toward the great hearth. Its fire had burned steadily throughout the evening. Now, fresh logs were laid upon it, sending new flames climbing up the chimney while soft orange light spread across the room. Chairs were gathered. Pipes were filled. Children, who had stubbornly insisted that they were not tired, suddenly discovered that there was no finer place in the world than beside a grandparent's knee. The cheerful noise of the evening softened. Voices lowered. The hour itself seemed to invite quieter conversation. Ichabod welcomed the change. He had long delighted in stories. Books had introduced him to legends from distant countries and forgotten centuries. Yet, he believed there was something especially satisfying about the tales told by those who claimed to have witnessed extraordinary things with their own eyes. Sleepy Hollow, it seemed, possessed no shortage of such witnesses. One gray-haired farmer began to describe strange lights that had appeared upon the old marsh road many years before. Another insisted he had heard unseen footsteps following him across the covered bridge long after midnight. A third claimed that certain lonely places among the woods were best avoided after sunset, not because anyone had proved them dangerous, but because generations of sensible people had quietly agreed that they were. No one laughed. Indeed, several listeners nodded as though these matters were already well understood. The stories grew stranger. A widow recalled hearing voices carried upon the windless evening when no living soul had been nearby. A traveler spoke of disappearing figures glimpsed along forgotten lanes. Another described hearing horses galloping across empty fields where no rider could afterward be found. Each tale seemed more remarkable than the last. Whether every story was entirely true mattered surprisingly little. The telling itself was part of the Hollow's inheritance. The room grew quieter. Outside, darkness settled completely over the farm. The windows had become black mirrors, reflecting only the warm company gathered within. Now and then, the wind moved through the orchard. The branches answered with a whisper that seemed almost like distant voices. Ichabod drew unconsciously a little nearer to the fire. Then someone mentioned the old church. Conversation paused. Several heads turned. Even those who had been speaking fell silent. "There are few places in the hollow," one elderly gentleman observed, "with more stories attached to them." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. It was there, they said, near the ancient churchyard, that the restless horseman was most often seen: the Hessian, the soldier whose head had been carried away by a cannonball during the Revolution. Some believed he searched endlessly for what had been lost. Others insisted he rode merely because he could not remember how to stop. Still, others claim he vanished before sunrise each morning, disappearing in a flash as the first light touched the old church. Ichabod listened without moving. Every word settled firmly into his imagination. He had read many ghost stories, yet these were different. These belonged to real roads, real bridges, real woods through which he himself traveled. Then Brom Bones leaned comfortably forward in his chair. "I've seen him." The room became still. Brom was not known for frightening easily. He smiled faintly as every eye turned toward him. "It was late," he began. "I'd been riding home from Sing Sing. The moon was bright enough that a man could see the road before him. I heard another horse coming behind me. I looked back, and there he was, a rider upon a great black horse. He carried no head." Several children edged closer to their parents. Brom continued calmly. "I've never cared to give the road to anyone, so I challenged him." A few smiles appeared around the circle. That sounded exactly like Brom. "We rode together. Then we raced. His horse was fast. So was Daredevil." Brom glanced toward the stable as though remembering the race. "For a while I believed I'd beat him." "What happened?" someone asked. Brom grinned. "We came to the church bridge. I gave Daredevil his head. He leaped the bridge. The horseman—" Brom paused, just long enough for every listener to lean forward. "Vanished." Several people quietly nodded. One woman crossed herself. Another declared that everyone knew spirits could not pass the bridge. No one seemed inclined to argue. Ichabod felt the pleasant warmth of the fire diminish just a little. He looked toward the nearest window. Beyond the glass lay only darkness. Somewhere beyond those fields stood the church. Somewhere beyond the church ran the very road he must travel before the night was over. The laughter that followed Brom's story sounded softer now. The fire settled with a shower of sparks. One of the logs shifted. For just a moment, the room fell silent again. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, and Ichabod told himself it was only the wind. Even so, when he glanced once more toward the dark windows, he found himself wondering what might be watching from beyond the lantern light. The evening was growing late, very late, and before long, it would be time to ride home. And now, the music has grown quiet. The last of the candles burn low within the Van Tassel farmhouse. The laughter of friends has softened into gentle conversation around the fading fire. Beyond the windows, Sleepy Hollow waits beneath a peaceful autumn sky. The trees whisper softly in the night breeze. The old church stands silent among the hills. And somewhere along those winding country roads, a lonely rider will soon begin his journey home. But that is a story for another evening. For now, I hope the warmth of the fire stays with you a little longer. I hope the gentle music, the harvest feast, and the golden glow of autumn accompany you into peaceful dreams. Thank you for listening to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. If tonight's story brought you a little peace, I'd love for you to subscribe so you can always find your way back whenever you need a quiet place to rest. Until next time, may your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep. Good night.